Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical trivia and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, First Fruits. Adventure ideas can come from anywhere, and this one comes from a podcast I was listening to while out stepping eggs for Pokemon Go. A farmer in South Africa mentioned that because his orchards are in the mountains, his apples ripen 2 weeks earlier than everyone else's, and this gives him a price premium. Seasonal fruit is brilliant as a treasure because it needs your characters to do things immediately to secure its value. On hearing this, I immediately thought of two plot hooks, and I'd like to share them now. Back when we were writing the China book, which you've never heard of because it fell through, one of my favourite plot hooks was the melon bandits. To explain, in the west of China, they grew melons. They still do. They're dried for export, but they're most valuable at the start of the season in the capital city when perfectly fresh. And this means that carts of precious melons come over mountain passes, and bandits try to steal them. Now, when I first heard about melon bandits, I remember just thinking it was a lovely idea. It was something that I really wanted to set a campaign around, although sadly I haven't been able to play it yet. It involves a treasure that smells wonderful, looks wonderful, you can cut up and share as snacks on your gaming table. I love the idea of a team of men inching through a jagged valley, checking the shadows, risking their lives for food so expensive that they don't dare eat it. I love the idea that there are bands of people skulking in the shadows, trying to find ways of making wagons break down or ambushing their guards so that they can steal these succulent orbs away and fence them in the cities through a secret black market of greengrocers. Now, of course, these don't need to be Chinese muskmelons. You could make the same claim pretty much anywhere in mythic Europe. It can be very difficult for modern readers, listeners, to grasp how extreme seasonality is in the food supply of Europe. We aren't used to seasonality in our foods, partially because we have refrigeration and partially because we have international transshippage of produce. Even very simple things used to be seasonal. A BLT sandwich, for example, used to mark the start of the tomato season, because tomatoes used to be seasonal. Now they can be deep frozen and coloured, although it doesn't affect their flavour very much, whenever people want to take them out of storage, and that's why you can have a BLT whenever you like. In mythic Europe, winter is a season of dietary monotony, and it's a season where you eat things like cured meat, pickled vegetables, brewed beer, fermented dairy products, not just because you prefer their flavour, but because that's the one way to get them to go through the winter. This is also why certain types of pie making were done, why food was preserved as jam. It lets you spread the season of abundance into the season where there's a dearth of fresh produce. And that's why the person who has the first melon of the season is paid such an enormous amount, because there's a pent-up demand, almost a madness that's caused by being forced to stay in your house due to inclement weather for months. This is also why Christmas is so raucous in some areas of Europe. A second plot idea that struck me when I heard the story of the South African apple grower was this. When I was very young, I remember watching on our ancient television a Christmas story about a cherry tree at Christmas. Now, at the time, I thought all the fuss that these people were making over cherries at Christmas was a little bit extraordinary because, of course, I have cherries every Christmas. I'm an Australian, and cherries, because they're vaguely like holly berries, I imagine, and they are plentiful at Christmas time, are an extremely popular Christmas food, and so I, as a young person, couldn't quite understand why these people were carrying on about it so much. It turns out that the television program was retelling a story called Sir Cleges and the Christmas Cherries, which comes from a 14th century poem, in which a very generous knight drives himself to penury by giving his money away to the various people who need it, and when he and his wife are praying, God sends them a miracle by making their cherry tree provide cherries in the middle of winter. Cleges takes the cherries to Uther Pendragon, a friend of his from the good old days, who is the King of Britain, in the hope that his friend will forgive whatever has transpired between them and assist him with his finances. When he arrives at Uther's court, the people are shocked that he has these cherries because it's the middle of winter, and to get past the first guard, he has to agree with the guard to give 1/3 of whatever he is given for the cherries. Then to get past the king's chamberlain, he again has to give up 1/3 of whatever he is given for the cherries, and of course when he meets the king's steward, the same deal is struck. When he finally sees the king says, "What can I give you for this magnificent gift?" And the man says, 12 strokes with my staff. And when the people come to collect, he beats them up. Afterwards, the king takes him aside and says, "You're not allowed to beat up my servants. Who do you think you are?" And he says he's Sir Cleges, and he explains what's happened. And the king goes, "Well, I'm not giving you the following for your cherries. Here have lands and gold, and promise not to give it all away, because generosity is foolish." Well, he doesn't actually say that, but that's the implication. And so Sir Cleges goes back to his castle, which is in Cardiff, and lives happily for many years. Now, if you heard cherries had suddenly appeared in the middle of winter, the obvious question for your mages is this something that God has done, or is this just a viz source? So you'd go and have a look and see whether the cherries are just Creoviz. If they're just Creoviz, you can actually steal them and use some of the cherries to create more natural cherries near the tree that the guy can then just take to the king and no one will be any the wiser. The old Creo bait and switch. The other alternative, of course, is that your character is the character who finds the cherries, and you're wanting to deliver them to the king as a gift so that you get a reciprocal gift. You have to find your way through the court politics to allow that. And you need to do it quickly, because otherwise the cherries will sour. I don't even know if that happens to European cherries. In Australia, because it's warmer, cherries which are left on their own for too long get mouldy. Honestly, in thinking about this story, the one thing that I'm particularly and profoundly struck by is that Europeans don't eat mangoes at Christmas. Australians have a mango season, which in the far north of the state that I live in, Queensland, acts as a sort of social season. Those of you who are from temperate climates are used to the idea that there are 4 seasons. Different Aboriginal groups in Australia had as many as 20 seasons, depending on which resources were available at various times. In North Queensland, because there are 3 seasons, hot, wet, and winter, which takes about a month, mango season delineates the time around Christmas. Mango season is also associated with a socially bound psychiatric condition called going troppo, which leads to Australians acting like they're drunk even though they're not drunk. Speaking as a person who has never gone troppo, I have to say that living in the northern part of my state during this season is about as much fun as being the designated driver in a nightclub, except for 3 straight months. But enough of my problems. This leads to the third of the plot hooks I thought of. During mango season in Australia, it is traditional that the first case of mangoes delivered for sale be auctioned, and the proceeds of the auction go to charity. There is a great deal of social cachet amongst the people in the areas that produce mangoes in paying far too much for this case of mangoes. It goes for tens of thousands of dollars some years. Individual mangoes from these trays then become gifts you can give to people. Here's a $1,000 mango. Indeed, in some years, the farmer that produces the first tray of mangoes is the person who purchases the first tray of mangoes through the auction process. Now, in mythic Europe, you could have a similar system where an order of monks, for example, arranges a charitable auction of the first fruits of a particular harvest, and local merchant families in a town compete to be the ones who make the purchase to improve their social cachet. This could be particularly important for magicians who use a family of puppets to act as their intermediaries, puppet noblemen. So just as a quick recap, the seasonality of food in mythic Europe causes its price to fluctuate remarkably. This can lead to land-based piracy for things like muskmelons. It can lead to kings giving manors for a bowl of cherries. And it can spur political contests over the auctions of something as simple as a tray of apples.